Section 2, the theory of plate tectonics. By the 1960s, evidence supporting continental drift and seafloor spreading led to the development of a theory called plate tectonics. Plate tectonics is a theory that explains why and how continents move and is the study of the formation of features on the Earth's crust. Earth's crust and the rigid upper part of the mantle form a layer of the Earth called the lithosphere. The lithosphere forms the thin outer shell of the Earth. It is broken into several blocks called tectonic plates that ride on a deformable layer of mantle called the asthenosphere. In much of the same way that blocks of wood float on water, the asthenosphere is a layer of plastic rock just below the asthenosphere. Plastic rock is solid rock that is under pressure and that flows very slowly, like putty does. Figure 1 shows that tectonic plates may look like. Earth's crust is classified into two types, oceanic crust and continental crust. Oceanic crust is dense and is made up of rock that is rich in iron and magnesium. Continental crust has low density and is made up of rock that is rich in silica. Tectonic plates can include continental crust, oceanic crust, or both. The continents and oceans are carried along on moving tectonic plates in the same way that passengers are carried on a bus. Scientists have identified about 15 major tectonic plates. While many plates are bordered by major surface features such as mountain ranges or deep trenches in oceans and boundaries of plates that are not always easily identified. As shown in Figure 2, a familiar outline of the continents and the ocean does not always match the outlines of plate boundaries. Some plate boundaries are located within continents far from mountain ranges. Earthquakes. Scientists identify plate boundaries primarily by studying data from earthquakes. When tectonic plates move, sudden shifts can occur along their boundaries. These sudden movements are called earthquakes. Frequent earthquakes in a given zone are evidence that two or more plates may meet in that area. Volcanoes. The location of volcanoes can also help identify the location of plate boundaries. Some volcanoes form when plate motions generate magma that erupt on the Earth's surface. For example, the Pacific Ring of Fire is a zone of active volcanoes that encircle the Pacific Ocean. This zone is also one of Earth's major earthquake zones. The characteristics of this zone indicate that the Pacific Ocean is surrounded by plate boundaries. Types of boundaries. Some of the most dramatic changes in Earth's crust, such as earthquakes and volcanic eruptions, happen along plate boundaries. Plate boundaries may be in the middle of the ocean floor, around the edges of continents, or even within continents. There are three types of plate boundaries. These plate boundaries are divergent boundaries, convergent boundaries, and transform boundaries. Each plate boundary is associated with a characteristic type of geologic activity. Divergent boundaries. The way that plates move relative to each other determines how a plate boundary affects the Earth's surface. At divergent boundaries, two plates move away from each other. A divergent boundary is illustrated in Figure 3. At divergent boundaries, magma from the asthenosphere rises to the surface as the plate moves apart. The magma then cools to form a new oceanic lithosphere. The new formed rock at the ridges is warm and light. This warm, light rock is elevated from the surrounding seafloor to form an undersea mountain range known as a mid-ocean ridge. Along the center of the mid-ocean ridge is a rift valley, a narrow valley that forms where the plates separate. Most divergent boundaries are located on ocean floors. However, rift valleys may also form where continents are separated by plate movements. For example, the Red Sea occupies a rift valley formed by the separation of the African plate and the Arabian plate as shown in Figure 3. Convergent boundaries. As plates pull apart at one boundary, they push into neighboring plates at other boundaries. Convergent boundaries are boundaries that form where two plates collide. Three types of collisions can happen at convergent boundaries. One type happens when oceanic lithosphere collides with continental lithosphere, as shown in Figure 4. Because oceanic lithosphere is denser, it subducts or sinks under the less dense continental lithosphere. The region along the plate boundary where one plate moves under another plate is called a subduction zone. Deep ocean trenches form at subduction zones as the oceanic plate subducts. It heats up and releases fluids into the mantle above it. The addition of these fluids causes the material in the overlying mantle to melt to form magma. The magma rises to the surface and forms volcanic mountains. A second type of collision occurs when two plates made of continental lithosphere collide. In this type of collision, neither plate subducts because neither plate is dense enough to subduct under another plate. Instead, the colliding edge crumples and thickens, which causes uplift that forms large mountain ranges. The Himalaya mountains formed in this type of collision. The third type of collision happens between two plates that are made of oceanic lithosphere. One plate subducts under another plate, and deep ocean trenches form. Fluids released from the subducted plate cause mantle rock to melt and form magma. The magma rises to the surface to form an island arc, which is a chain of volcanic islands. Japan is an example of an island arc. Transform boundaries. The boundary at which two plates slide past each other horizontally, as shown in Figure 5, is called a transform boundary. However, the plate edges usually do not slide along smoothly. Instead, they scrape against each other in a series of sudden spurts of motion that are felt as earthquakes. Unlike other types of boundaries, transform boundaries do not produce magma. The San Andreas Fault in California is a major transform boundary between the North American plate and the Pacific plate. Transform motion also occurs along mid-ocean ridges. Short segments of the mid-ocean ridge are connected by transform boundaries called fracture zones. Table 1 summarizes the three types of boundaries. The table also describes how each type of plate boundary changes the Earth's surface and includes example of each type of plate boundary. Divergent, plates moving away from each other to form rifts in mid-ocean valleys. The examples are North American and Eurasian plates at the mid-ocean ridge. Convergent boundaries, plates moving towards each other and collide to form ocean trenches, mountain ranges, volcanoes, and island arcs. South America and Nazca plate at the Chilean Trench along the west coast of South America. Transform boundaries, plates sliding past each other while moving in opposite directions. North America and the Pacific plates at the San Andreas Fault in California. Causes of the plate motion. Scientists don't fully understand what forces drives plate tectonics. Many scientists think that the movement of tectonic plates is partly due to convection. Convection is the movement of heated material due to differences in density that are caused by differences in temperature. This process can be modeled by boiling water in a pot on the stove. As the water at the bottom of the pot is heated, the water at the bottom expands and becomes less dense than the cooler water above it. The cooler, denser water sinks, and the warmer water rises to the surface to create a cycle called a convection cell. Scientists think that the Earth is also a convection system. Energy generated by the Earth's core and radioactivity within the mantle heat mantle materials. This heated material rises through the cooler, denser material around it. As the hot material rises, the cooler, denser material flows away from the hot material and sinks into the mantle to replace the rising material. As the mantle material moves, it drags the overlying tectonic plates along with it, as shown in Figure 6. Convection currents and the resulting drag on the bottom of the tectonic plates can explain many aspects of this movement, but scientists have identified two mechanisms of the convection that helps the process of plate movement. Ridge push. Newly formed rock at the mid-ocean ridge is warm, less dense than the older rock nearby. The warm, less dense rocks is elevated above the rock, and the older, denser rock slopes downward away from the ridge. As the newer, warmer rock cools and becomes denser, it begins to sink into the mantle and pull away from the ridge. As the cooling rock sinks the asthenosphere below, it exerts a force on the rest of the plate. This force is called ridge push. This force pushes the rest of the plate away from the mid-ocean ridge. The ridge push is illustrated in Figure 7. Scientists think that ridge push may help drive plate motions. However, most scientists agree that ridge push is not the main driving force of the plate motion. So scientists looked at convergent boundaries for other clues to the forces that drive plate motion. Slab pull. Where plates pull away from each other at the mid-ocean ridge, magma from the asthenosphere rises to the surface. The magma then cools to form new lithosphere. As the lithosphere moves away from the ocean, the lithosphere cools and becomes denser. Where the lithosphere is dense enough, it begins to subduct into the asthenosphere. As the leading edge of this plate sinks, it pulls the rest of the plate along behind it. The force exerted by the sinking plate is called slab pull. This process is shown in Figure 8. In general, plates that are subducting move faster than plates that are not subducting. This evidence indicates that the downward pull of the subducting lithosphere is a strong driving force for tectonic motion. All three mechanisms of the Earth's convection system, drag on the bottom of the tectonic plates, ridge push, and slab pull, work together to drive plate motions. These mechanisms form a system that makes the Earth tectonics plates move constantly.